You just got your commissioned model back, or maybe you purchased a pre-made, you open up VTube Studio, and you have no clue what's going on. That's okay. Today, I'll be giving you a crash course in everything that you need to know about this app. There's a lot to cover today, so here's a breakdown of everything we'll be discussing, from the model import all the way to model recolors, effects, and Twitch redeems. If you're looking for something in particular, feel free to use the timestamps in the description. Let's start by actually getting the app. You can pick up VTube Studio on Steam. The app itself is free, but it does come with a watermark. If you want, you can purchase a DLC that removes the watermark for you, although if you're in a pinch, you can crop out the watermark to a degree. There is another DLC available as well for VTuber collabs. If you buy that DLC, you'll be able to collab with other VTubers and have their models on screen next to yours. If you want to buy all of the DLC, the app will cost you about $35 USD total. Before we actually open the app though, you need to consider first what form of tracking you're going to be using. If your model doesn't have any form of face tracking and uses either mouth tracking or a mic input for movement, then you can go ahead and skip this section. Otherwise, you'll have to pick a form of tracking. I could do a whole video on this alone, but I'll give you a breakdown. Try not to get overwhelmed because it does get a little bit confusing. If you need basic tracking, you can get away with a webcam. Webcam is super easy to set up. All you have to do is plug it into your PC and turn it on in VTube Studio. And if you have an NVIDIA card, you can actually use a slightly better form of webcam tracking through NVIDIA Broadcast. If you want better, more accurate tracking, you can use a phone, either Android or iOS, with the VTube Studio app. And if you want very, very accurate tracking, including blend shapes for things like lip pucker, tongue out, and so on, then you should use exclusively iOS with an additional app like Vitamins or Vbridger in tandem with VTube Studio. Keep in mind that those apps require the model to be rigged for those things. You can't just use Vbridger for a model that isn't rigged for it. So if you have a pre-built, make sure that the model is compatible before bothering picking up the app. If you're choosing to use one of those enhanced tracking apps, you still need an initial tracking app, which can be VTube Studio, but there are other options as well, so make sure to do your research and choose which one is best for you, and cross-reference that the app can communicate with that specific mobile tracking app as well. From there, the desktop app will use VTube Studio's API to send tracking information and new parameters over. I'm not going to be going over the VTube Studio API today since it opens the doors to dozens of plugins and customization options, but I will be covering an example of how you would connect one of those external plugins for your tracking if that's something that you're planning to do. The rundown for pricing overall is as follows. So $35 if you want all of the DLC for the desktop app for VTube Studio. VTube Studio Mobile for the Pro version is about $22. Vbridger costs $10. So if you plan to use that app, you will need to purchase that as well. And if you want the editor, it's an additional $20, but you don't need the editor for basic configuration. So only buy that if you intend to make changes to the default Vbridger configuration. Vitamins is free. That's the app that I use personally. However, there's much less support for it. So just expect to be on a sinking ship if that's the route that you go. If you're curious, my personal setup involves iOS with VTube Studio mobile app using Wi-Fi connection and in tandem with Vitamins. There are tons of configurations though, like I mentioned before, so I recommend doing your research, picking what's in your budget first, and going from there. We'll talk about the tracking connection process in a bit. After picking up VTube Studio, you can either run it on Steam, or if you want to save some resources on your PC, which is important if your PC is not very powerful, then you can also open up the app folder and run the app without Steam. Once you have the app open, you can double click to open the main menu. This top icon is what we'll be working with next. It's where you load in your model. To the right of that is the screenshots menu. Then we have backgrounds, items, model and items lock, settings, logs, and the collabs menu. But let's move on and get our model set up first, as that's the most important thing. If you don't have a model, I do have a tutorial on how to make a simple PNG tuber using free software, but you can also find inexpensive pre-made models on Etsy, VGen, or Coffee. And you can even load in free models from the Steam Workshop by searching something up and adding them to your library. The Steam Workshop's even accessible from within VTube Studio right here. All you have to do is pull it up and search what you're hunting down, and it'll automatically download the model and add it to your library. Regardless of how you get your model, you should have a model folder ready to go. If you use the Steam Workshop, it should be already downloaded into your models folder, so nothing to worry about in your situation. But in most cases, you'll have a zip file that contains a model folder. If your model folder is structured properly, you will have a main folder with your model runtime file, which contains all of the deformer information, your vertex information, etc., your model JSON file, which has references and some extra info, your physics file, which has all of your physics setup info, a CDI3 file, which isn't really needed, but you'll likely have anyway, And lastly, your textures folder. If you're missing any of those necessary files, your model will fail to load, so make sure that everything is structured correctly. If you want your model to have an icon, you can also drop that into your model folder. Just make sure it's 512 by 512 pixels and either JPEG or PNG format. Later on, we will also be setting some expressions. You might have some already, and if you don't worry, it's not like needed for the model to run or anything, but these can be loose in the main folder, and if you want, you can put them in a subfolder if you want them to be neatly contained. This applies to animations as well. To load your model in, we actually have to go through our file explorer. Your models folder will be within your VtubeStudio app path under VtubeStudio Data, Streaming Assets, Live 2D Models. We can drag and drop our model in here. Drop the entire folder, not just the contents. To actually open the model up, you'll click the little person icon and your model should be here. If it's not, sometimes it takes a second to load if you just put it in, so just open and close the menu a few times and eventually you'll see it pop up. Then just click on it and it should load everything in. If it's a freshly exported model, you'll get a prompt asking you about the model setup. This is telling you that the model doesn't have any tracking parameters set up, animations, hotkeys, etc. And if you select auto setup, it will automatically populate standard parameters into your tracking parameter setup. I do recommend doing this if you followed a basic Live 2D tutorial and are using standard parameters for things like mouth open, mouth form, head XYZ, and so on. It will save you some pain because it is a tedious process to add all of those parameters manually, so just click through the setup and it should populate all those parameters for you. If you mess up and decide that you want that later, you can also auto setup from the parameter menu as well. So don't worry about making the wrong choice or anything, you can always go back and overwrite with auto setup or even just add auto setup after you decided that you did actually want it. If you have a new export of a model that you already have set up, you can also use auto setup to copy over all of those parameters from the old model. You can even copy things like expressions and animations as well. Otherwise, I will be going over manual setup in just a moment. If you didn't get this prompt, that means that your model has already been prepped. This should be the case for any pre-made models as well as any models that you might have commissioned from a Live 2D rigger. Once your model is loaded in, we can left click and drag to move it, scroll to zoom, and hold Control while scrolling to spin the model. Once you get your model situated, you can lock it in place by pressing the yellow lock in the main menu. Changing your background is going to be in the green photo menu. You can choose from a selection of available backgrounds, or you can add your own by adding it to your backgrounds folder. This is also accessible from the settings menu, but if you want, you can just drag and drop it like we did with our models. It should then be accessible from the background menu. In most cases, you'll be using your model for streaming though, in which case you'll want transparency. The best way to achieve this is by selecting Color Picker and setting it to transparent in capture. We won't be going over the OBS side of things today, but toggling this background on specifically will allow you to capture your VTuber without a background. You can use game capture, but it replicates the menus, so the best way to capture your VTuber is via Spout 2. Spout 2 supports transparency and hides the menus. It's the most performant capture type for VtubeStudio. If you intend to set that up later, I do have a full video on the process, but in short, you have to download and install a plugin and make sure to toggle on Spout 2 within VtubeStudio. I'll leave a link to that video in the description. Let's actually set up our model tracking now though. Go to the cog menu, and here you have 4 main tabs: General Settings, Tracking Settings, Model Configuration, and then Expressions and Animations menu. If you plan to use a webcam, go to the second tab, and you'll configure your webcam here. Toggle your webcam on so you can see the feed, and make sure that it's unobstructed and accurately tracking before you move on. If you have an NVIDIA card and want to use the improved NVIDIA tracking, be sure to install the tracking DLC via Steam. If you're using an iPhone for tracking, it's a little bit more complicated, so if you're a webcam user and you're already good to go, feel free to skip ahead. You can use a cable or Wi-Fi for connection. Android only supports Wi-Fi connection though, no cables. Cable is more stable for iPhone, but you have to 1. Run another cable, and 2. Possibly have to download iTunes so that your PC accurately registers your phone? It can be a nightmare in my experiences, but it's nice to avoid network troubles this way. It might be less of a problem if you're not using a Windows device like I am. If you're doing this from an iOS device, it might go over much smoother. In any case, open the phone app now. You can pull up the menu in the same way, so double tap, then go to your settings. If you'll be using Wi-Fi, make sure to buy Pro, then scroll down to this section. For USB, toggle on the USB option. Then on desktop, once plugged in, do the same. If your phone is properly plugged in, you should be able to instantly connect. On Windows though, your phone should show up in your devices list. If it's not there, that means it's not being recognized correctly. And one of the main solutions to this problem is to download and install iTunes, which is like an ancient software at this point. Once it registers your phone with an iTunes, you should be able to try the USB connection in VtubeStudio again. I used to use this method personally and found that I had to open and close every single app over and over again, unplug and replug in my phone until it worked. I don't recommend it for this reason, but if you have a terrible Wi-Fi connection, it can be a great option. For the Wi-Fi route, we'll be using the sections just above the USB section. We need to give our phone our computer's information first, so pull up your computer's IP address. You can find this by typing ipconfig in your command prompt, but you can also just select show IP list in VtubeStudio and pull your IPv4 from here. Just make sure you're not streaming for obvious reasons. Make sure both apps have the same port, which is 25565 by default. Then start the server on desktop and connect to your PC on mobile. You should see a green light if you have a proper connection. If you're using an additional app like Vbridger, you will need to open that app and configure your phone's connection to this app as well. I don't have time to go over every possible iteration of this, so I'll just be using what I believe to be the most likely combination if you're using ARKit tracking, which would probably be Vbridger with the VtubeStudio mobile app. First, I would grab my phone's IP address. You can find this under your Wi-Fi settings, where you can select your network and scroll down to where your phone's IP is listed. This is the IP that your tracking plugin will connect to. Once connected to your phone, you'll be streaming tracking data from your phone into the desktop plugin. Now you need the plugin to further communicate information to VtubeStudio. You'll want to set the connection to VtubeStudio, toggle it on, and then wait for VtubeStudio to prompt you for API access. Once you allow Vbridger access, you should be able to see your model taking inputs from Vbridger. If you have a different combination than this example, or experience any difficulties during the plugin tracking setup, I recommend checking out the respective developer's Discord server to ask questions and troubleshoot. With your tracking connected, you may or may not see your model responding, dependent on whether it's already got tracking parameters configured. We'll set those up in a moment if they aren't ready on your model yet, but let's open up our model configuration menu for a tour of the basics first. If you have an idle expression or a tracking lost animation, you can add those files here. Idle animations will continue looping in eternity, and tracking lost animations will transition to and be in use while your model tracking is lost, in the case that your connection fails or you move out of frame or something like that. If you have any strange outlines on your model, which is common for models with deeper skin tones and with dark clothing, you can use this button to correct those lines. The button below that is for being able to run your model on your phone, which you most likely don't need, and larger models can crash the app anyway, so I would pretty much just ignore this button. The customize model section is for lighting and recolor options, which we'll get to later. The movement config section down here will track your physical space movement and will input that to your model's general position. If that's something that you're interested in, be sure to change your settings here. You can also mess with your physics settings as well. Just be careful if it's a pre-made or a commission, because your rigger likely already prepared the physics in a certain way, and you probably don't need to make any adjustments. However, if something is moving more or less than you would like, you can toggle the strength of individual physics parameters here. If you have any manual parameters to add, you will press the plus button and add the information here. The tracking input will be any of the standard input parameters, or any of the tracking inputs from apps like Vbridger. They will have a little label next to them letting you know which plugin they're from. And the output is the name of the parameter that controls the object on your model as it's listed in your model information. In most cases, the name will be the exact same because there are naming conventions for most of these standard parameters. You do have to repeat this process for every single parameter that you want to have tracked on your model, which is why automatic setup is a really nice thing to have. If you're using the VtubeStudio mobile app for tracking, on the mobile app you will need to adjust some basic settings in the webcam section here. You can adjust the sensitivity for some basic inputs here before messing with everything else on your desktop. If you change these settings in the VtubeStudio desktop app, it only applies to webcam tracking. So if you want to make these adjustments, make sure to make them in the mobile app if you're using your phone for tracking. Once all of your parameters are ready, we can now configure them to your needs. We're going to do that by adjusting the actual parameter range values. This is a bit convoluted, so I will try my best to explain, but just be nice to yourself as you're going through this because it can be kind of a weird process to learn how to do. On your model rigging, each parameter is rigged on a set of values. Most commonly, it will start at 0 and go to a positive and negative value symmetrically, so things like your head movement moving from positive 30 to negative 30, and at the center being 0. Or the second most common type of parameter is a parameter that goes from 0 to 1 with a default of 0. That's common for things like mouth open, so mouth closed would be 0 and mouth open would be 1. For most common parameters, these values are standardized, and I'll leave a resource below that goes over those standard values. The standard range for that input parameter should show up here. And the output range should be the same in most cases, unless your model was rigged to have a different value for some reason. Your actual tracking value that is being sent will be right here, and the scaled output will be showed in the symmetrical position on the right side. To configure a parameter to your needs, first calibrate your tracking. You need to have your tracking calibrated for this to work and be accurate. On desktop with webcam, it'll be here, and in the mobile app, you'll do it by tapping on this icon. In either case, after starting the calibration, look towards where you will be primarily looking straight and don't move until the calibration is finished. Now that you're calibrated, most standard parameters should be centered or hovering close to 0, aka the neutral point. The main concept for our adjustments here will be that our maximum input values should match up with our actual maximum range of body input. For the head turn, for example, if I turn my face the farthest that I can, it should, in theory, land at 30. But if it's not, that means that the model isn't taking advantage of the full range of the parameter. At maximum, it's getting fed a value that is lower than the max that it can actually reach. So we want to adjust our input to account for that. And once we do that, it will make sure to scale the output up so that you can actually reach those higher values without having to move your head farther or make any weird adjustments to the model. This can also be applied to things like mouth open. A common example is that people will have their mouth be slightly ajar despite not actually having their mouth open, because the default value is 0 and the tracking input might be picking up something like 0.008. You can simply change your input value for your mouth open at the lowest value to be 0.008, and then it will change 0.008 to put an output of 0. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. You can and should go through pretty much all of your parameters and make sure that your input range matches your face and personal movements. This pretty much means that you'll have to sit there making strange faces at yourself to figure out what the maximum input value is and adjusting your input range to match. At the end of the day, it's just because no two people will move the same, so even if your rigger did all of their best work trying to get the inputs to look really good, it's not going to match your face. So going through and adjusting them and making sure they match your face and your personal movements will help limit the stiffness in your model and improve your tracking. Please remember that puppeting your model with exaggerated movements also does a lot of the heavy lifting. If you feel like any inputs are very jittery, you can also turn on smoothing for them. And don't forget that you can toggle on auto blink for eye parameters if you have something like a PNG tuber and want them to automatically blink for you, and turn on auto breathing for your breath parameter. Before we move on to expressions and hotkeys, let's also talk about items. The items menu is accessible from here. You can select an item and spawn it in. If you have new items, like a purchasable asset from an online shop, you can, similarly to backgrounds and models, just drag and drop it into your items folder. Then it should show up in your list. There are a few different kinds of items, so let me give you an overview of them real quick. First, we have regular items, which are pretty much just like PNGs or GIFs. Then there are browser items, which let you load and interact with a web page, which includes support from local files as well. So you can load up pretty much anything that's on your PC, like an MP3, a WebM, even a fucking PDF if you want. And finally, we have live 2D items, which have their own rigging and movement, and are technically a model in themselves that you can pin onto your own model. Adding a PNG item is really easy. By default, it will be in front of your model, but you can choose to put it in front of or behind your model as well. You can also put it in between specific layers, and I'll go over that in just a second. For any item, you have the same adjustment controls, so scroll wheel, left click and drag, and control plus scroll to resize and move the item around. Get the item into the general position that you want and double click to lock it in place. The item should now be pinned to your model. However, sometimes models have invisible layers and masks, and you'll need to configure the pinning to pin to the correct item. If this becomes a problem on your model, you can exempt certain Artmesh from allowing pinning on them. You can go into the Customize Model menu and select Exclude Artmesh from Item Pinning. Within this menu, I would go ahead and turn off any masks that you have. You can filter them out by typing in mask in the search bar and toggling them off. If you want to configure anything further at this point, you can long press to pull up the item configuration. Here, I can tell it specifically what art mesh it should be following along with. In my case, if I had this band-aid and I wanted it to be on my cheek, I can look for the face color mesh and add it there. You can also see it is overlapping with my hair, which is undesirable, but thankfully, due to a recent update, we can actually pin items between layers on our Live 2D models now. So we can open up the item layer settings here, and at the top, it will be in front of everything, and at the bottom, the item will be behind everything. So if you want it to be in a specific place, you'll have to look for a sweet spot between the layers where it's, in my case, in front of the face, but behind the bangs. And it looks like it's right about here. So we can hit OK and finish up the item configuration. If you want to save this item config as a hotkey later, we can click the triple star menu to open the item scenes and make a new scene. Once you save that, it'll be accessible via hotkey later. The same setup applies for other item types, but they do have some additional options as well. For Live 2D items, for example, also with the recent update, we now have the option to split the item into a front and a back, if the rigger has configured it that way. This means you can tell VtubeStudio exactly between which layers you want the item and its own layers to exist. That means I could have the front of a blanket asset in front of my body, but maybe behind my hair, and then the back of it behind my body, but maybe in front of BugBot, for example. Don't forget that Live 2D items are also technically a model of their own, and some come with hotkeys. If you want to edit configurable settings or make new hotkeys for the item, you will have to take that item, put it in your models folder, load it as its own model, and then go through the hotkey process that we'll touch on in a bit. Once configured, you can then take the newly configured model and pop it back into your item assets, and now all of the new hotkeys should be available for use. If the item tracks weird, you can also open up the item configuration and adjust the settings here to better match the movement on your model. Finally, we have browser sources, which let you put in a URL and pin that loaded page to your model. The browser source is fully interactable if you have the setting turned on for it, meaning you can click and load whatever you want from that initial loading point. You can also turn on the local files setting and then load local files. So as long as you have access to that file on your PC, you should be able to load it in as a file. So you could load videos, text files, PDFs, images, pretty much anything. You can also load all of the contents of a folder itself. Just obviously be careful with this setting. It's off by default for a reason because you can expose some critical information if you're not careful about it. To get rid of an item, you can unlock the items in the scene and drag it to the invisible trash can in the bottom right, or you can go to the main menu and remove all scene items. Now that you understand items, we can finally move on to expression and hotkey setup, which can be found under this menu here. By the way, if this video is helpful to you at all, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment down below to help support my channel. Just know that for any of these hotkey options, you can link them to Twitch redeems, your Stream Deck via the Stream Deck VTube Studio plugin, or even through stream controllers like StreamerBot. So just be aware that you don't have to exclusively use them with a key press. There are other options as well. To make a new expression, select Expression Editor and create a new expression. Then you can name the expression and adjust whichever associated parameters you want. Then save the expression file by hitting OK. You can run through and make as many of these expressions as you want to. If you want them to have hotkeys, you can press plus to make a new hotkey, or if you want to generate them in bulk, you can select Create New Hotkeys for all unused expressions, and it will automatically generate hotkeys for every single new expression that you've made. If you're doing this manually though, you can just name the hotkey, change the hotkey type to expression, change to the expression you want to use, and then add your key input. Now you can easily toggle it on and off. You can change the hotkey to activate only during the key press, but in most cases you'll just want it to be on a toggle. You do also have the option to turn it off automatically, and you can adjust the fade time here as well. Hotkeys can also be used for animations. You can do things like swap your idle animation out for another idle animation, which is what I personally use to switch from my regular idle to my idle where BugBot has a set of keys and is shaking them. Or you can also run a one-time animation which toggles on and runs the animation once before stopping. If you have an animation in mind but don't have an animation file, one cool feature is that you can also record animations in VTube Studio. So as long as you can act it out in your model, you can save it as well. There are a lot of different options for hotkeys listed here aside from toggling expressions though, some of which are used for utility reasons, but the few that I want to discuss right now are going to be moving your model, changing Artmesh colors or scene lighting, and toggling VFX. Moving your model is very easy to set up. Simply move it to the adjusted position and press record position. I'd recommend having two main spots and a hotkey to swap between the two. If you're fancy, you can use a bot like StreamerBot to automate the switching depending on your OBS scene. To set up the lighting, let's first go to the webcam menu menu and scroll down. Here we can select which monitor to use for our lighting and toggle it on. There are some customization settings here, and these color dots on this side represent the left, right, and middle colors that are being pulled from your screen. You can toggle them on and off individually if you want. Once toggled on, go to the model menu and open Customize Model. Then select Customize Scene Lighting. Any art mesh that you toggle down on the slider here will remain exempt from lighting, which makes it appear as if it's been brightened. The most common setup is to just do your iris and eye components to make them look like they're glowing. Once you're done with your setup, you can hit OK, and then you can use this lighting setting as a toggle in your hotkeys menu. Color setup is similar. You can also do this from the Customize Model menu and select Customize Multiply Screen Color for Artmesh here. From here, toggle on the individual component and set the color for Screen and Multiply. Once you do one, you can select Paste Last Color so that the process goes a little bit quicker when you're doing tons and tons of Artmesh. It does take an extremely long time to do this. Alternatively, if this is too much work for you, you can use a plugin like VtubeStudio Chameleon or something like StreamerBot to change the colors as well, as color tint is accessible through the API. But once you're done with your recolor, you can finish up and choose this Artmesh setup as a hotkey as well. Finally, we have VFX. VFX is under the Webcam menu where you can toggle it on and then click Selected Effects to configure. There's a list of a ton of different effects, which you can fully adjust and combine to your liking. Just know that some of these do change appearance depending on your capture method, and that using a ton of them in tandem might cause stress on your GPU. If you want a full overview of the available effects and the differences in capture methods, I also have a video on that too, so I'll link that below. Once configured, you can save it as a preset, which is then accessible via hotkey. The last thing that we have to cover is Twitch integration. Any of the hotkeys that we just made are usable via Twitch integration, though there are some other features as well. To set it up, go to the main settings menu and scroll down to the Twitch settings section. From here, select Connect Account and give VtubeStudio permissions to your Twitch. Then you should be able to log in and activate. And once you've done that, you can open the configuration and set up your Twitch integrations here. There's an emote dropper and a Twitch message option, which are really fun to add as an overlay. Just obviously be careful with the chat one, of course. For the hotkey triggers, open this and toggle it on, then check done. And now when you reopen your expressions list, you can click on the Twitch icon and configure which options you would like to apply as conditions for this hotkey to be set off. As long as you're connected to your Twitch, these should be completely functional and work automatically during your streams. And with that, I think that's a pretty decent crash course in everything you'll need to know about VtubeStudio as a beginner. If there's anything you wish I covered more on, let me know in the comments below. But happy VTubing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!